Hey everybody, it's Mike from Frito History. Today, I'm on top of the Culps Hill Observation Tower at the Gettysburg National Military Park. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Maryland versus Maryland battle that happened here on Culps Hill in July of 1863. Now, Culps Hill wasn't featured much in the first day's battle at Gettysburg. This is where the Union retreated back to that night. And by the second day of battle, the Union line resembles a fish hook, with the barb of that fish hook resting here on Culps Hill. So, Robert E. Lee's plan of attack for July the 2nd was for Longstreet to attack the Union left back there in that direction, and for Ewell, who's now commanding Stonewall Jackson's old corps, to attack the Union right here on Culps Hill and Cemetery Hill. Despite Maryland remaining as a slave state during the Civil War, it never seceded from the Union. And because of this, Maryland becomes a split state, with some Marylanders supporting the Union and not supporting secession, and some Marylanders supporting secession and also viewing themselves as Southerners. So because of this, there are regiments in both the Confederate Army and the Union Army that are raised in the state of Maryland, and some of them carry the same name, including the 1st Maryland Infantry. Early during the Civil War, Marylanders who were sympathetic to the Confederacy often went down into Virginia to join the Virginia regiments, and Bradley Johnson, who was a Marylander, decided that he should form 6 companies and that they should fight under the banner of their own state, the state of Maryland. And that's where he forms the 1st Maryland Confederate Infantry. Under the leadership of Bradley T. Johnson, the 1st Maryland Confederate Infantry fought valiantly at the battles of Manassas and during Stonewall Jackson's legendary Valley Campaign, where, during the Battle of Front Royal, they engaged with the 1st Maryland Union Infantry for the first time. And here at the Battle of Gettysburg, they are fighting in their own George Maryland Stewart's Brigade. And the defenders of Culps Hill are 12th Corps soldiers. This monument right here is to George Sears Green. He's a Rhode Islander, and he's the one who orders his men to construct breastworks here on Culps Hill, which will prove to be a pretty smart decision later on in the battle. Now, on July the 2nd, as parts of the 12th Corps were ordered from Culps Hill to other parts of the Union line as reinforcements, Greene was ordered to defend Culps Hill with just a brigade of the 12th Corps, and he did that, earning him the nickname of the Hero of Culps Hill. And on July the 2nd, Dan Sickles famously moves his corps out to the vicinity of the Peach Orchard, creating a bump or a salient in the Union line, and soldiers from the 12th Corps here on Culps Hill are ordered to provide reinforcements out in the vicinity of the Union left. As darkness falls on the battlefield, Ewell orders Johnson's division to take Culps Hill. The Virginians are coming in that direction, the Marylanders are coming up this direction, and they're pinching on the 137th New York's position right here. And they force the 137th New York out of the breastworks, which are seen behind the monument, back towards the traverse behind me on Upper Culps Hill. Later that night, the 12th Corps troops, who had reinforced the Union left earlier that day, found that the Confederates had occupied their breastworks that they had erected earlier that day here. And General Slocum, commanding the 12th Corps, ordered that his commanders drive the enemy out by daylight. 4 a.m. on the morning of July the 3rd, a massive Union artillery barrage opened up on the Confederate positions here around Culps Hill. The opening shot was from a Maryland battery. Later that morning, the Confederates were ordered to renew their attacks from the night before, with the 1st Maryland Battalion of the Confederate Army charging into the saddle between Upper and Lower Culps Hill at the point of bayonet. We are about to walk in the footsteps of the 1st Maryland Battalion of the Confederate Army here on Culps Hill. The 1st Maryland Battalion would charge across this field with their position straddling across this stone wall. Company A would charge on the right side of this wall under the command of Captain William Murray, who was killed leading that charge, and the rest of the companies were on the left side of that wall, charging into the saddle this direction. The 1st Maryland would charge into this position, facing an enfilading fire from 3 sides. The carnage here later caused a 1st Marylander to note this location as a slaughter pen. And reportedly, the brigade commander, George Maryland Stewart, wept as he saw his boys charging into this vicious melee. As Stewart's brigade pushed off toward the Union line, the 12th Corps soldiers on Culps Hill finalized their defenses. 5 companies of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry in the Union Army take position next to the 150th New York on General Greene's left, while the rest of the 4 companies move approximately 300 yards south to relieve the 28th Pennsylvania, positioned perpendicular to the stone wall that the Secesh Maryland Regiment is straddling. Their shrieking rebel yells and glistening bayonets inch closer and closer to their Yankee counterparts. As Stewart's line surges forward, the Federal soldiers unleashed a hail of lead upon their advancing Southerners. Stewart's line wavered and stalled in front of the Union positions that the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry held up in. It is approximately at that time that the 20th Connecticut Infantry and the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade entered the field and pushed the survivors of Stewart's faltering line back. And this marker notes the location of the furthest advance of the 1st Maryland Battalion of the Confederate Army on Culps Hill. The 1st Maryland had a mascot, a dog named Gracie, who had led the regiment that day, and as Marylanders were laying dead on the field here, she walked up to her owner and started licking his hands, and a volley from the Union infantry fired out and riddled the dog with bullets. Union General Thomas Kane, who witnessed the carnage here in the saddle in between Upper and Lower Culps Hill, later mentioned that Gracie was the only Christian-minded being on either side, and he ordered his soldiers to give Gracie a full soldier's burial here on the battlefield. And tragically, some of the men who the 1st Maryland Confederate Battalion were charging against were soldiers of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Regiment of the Union Army, men from their own state. And I'm sure you've heard the Civil War as being a brothers' war. And for these 2 1st Marylands, it really was. You had some families with members splitting and some joining the 1st Maryland Eastern Regiment, part of the Union Army, and some other family members joining the 1st Maryland Confederate Infantry. And they met here on Culps Hill. In fact, the color sergeant of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore, whose name was Robert Ross, was the first cousin of the color sergeant of the 1st Maryland Confederate Battalion. And Color Sergeant P.M. Moore died while charging against the infantry in which his own cousin was carrying the flag for. Terribly ironic. And this monument right here is dedicated to the 1st Regiment Eastern Shore Maryland Infantry. This is the 1st Maryland Union Infantry that 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment were charging against. And they were formed in Cambridge, Maryland in September of 1861. They were originally under the leadership of Colonel James Wallace, who you see his name is listed right there. He was a slave owner, a lawyer from the state of Maryland. And in fact, he was so staunch on his beliefs that in late 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, he resigned his commission from the Army because of his beliefs of African Americans fighting in the Union Army, which he did not support. And it's a little hard to see, but you can still see some of the breastworks that were constructed that day by members of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry. And the monument depicts a member of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry crouched behind breastworks and rocks, and you could see some of those rocks out there in the distance. Now, the main body of the 1st Maryland Infantry would have been fighting here. Now, they had a detachment that was fighting about 300 yards away. That would have been the soldiers who were fighting against the 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment that day. But the monument is located here, where the main body of the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry was fighting that day. And just to add to the whole confusion of all the 1st Maryland's fighting here on Culps Hill, there's a 3rd regiment designated as the 1st Maryland Infantry fighting on Culps Hill, and that's the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, who had fought only at Maryland Heights during the Antietam campaign before the Battle of Gettysburg. After Gettysburg, they fought at the Battle of Monocacy. And the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade were one of the 12th Corps regiments who were ordered off of Culps Hill to reinforce the Union left on July the 2nd. On July the 3rd, they returned here to Culps Hill and helped repulse some of Johnson's division here in the area of Spangler's Spring, which you can see back there a little bit behind me. In 1884, the veterans of the 1st Maryland Confederate Infantry dedicated this monument to their regiment here on Culps Hill. Now, it might confuse you because down there it says 2nd Maryland Infantry, not 1st Maryland Infantry. Well, if you look closely, it does say 1st Maryland changed to 2nd Maryland. That's likely due to the fact that during the war, the 1st Marylands of the Union and Confederate armies had formed bitter rivalries, probably because they were from the same state and carried the same names, and had met each other on numerous battlefields, including Front Royal and Culps Hill. When veterans of the 1st Maryland Confederate Battalion wished to dedicate a monument to their regiment at the Gettysburg battlefield, they were met in protest by the Union veterans, particularly from the 1st Maryland Eastern Shore Infantry, who did not want there to be confusion between which monument was to which regiment. And to eliminate any confusion, the Confederate Maryland Infantry dedicated their monument as the 2nd Maryland Infantry. Now, during the time of battle, they were the 1st Maryland Battalion, but later in the war, they were designated as the 2nd Maryland Infantry. So this is their name, just not the name they carried during the Battle of Gettysburg. In November of 1994, the Maryland State Memorial was dedicated near the site of one of the old Gettysburg Visitor Centers, adjacent from the National Cemetery. It depicts 2 wounded Marylanders, 1 Yankee and 1 rebel. The 2 soldiers have put aside their differences and are helping each other in the horrific aftermath of the battle. The monument also features images of both the Lord Baltimore flag, which was popular with Maryland's Unionist population, and the Crosslands banner, which was popular with rebel Marylanders, and is also featured on the Confederate Maryland Monument. The heraldic flags come from the shield and the coat of arms of George Calvert, who chartered the colony of Maryland. In October of 1888, Maryland National Guard soldiers carried the alternating pattern flag during a dedication ceremony of Union Maryland Regiment's monuments at the Gettysburg National Battlefield during one of the earliest recorded official uses of the modern Maryland flag. The inscription on the monument states, "Brother against brother would be their legacy, particularly on the slopes of Culps Hill."